A large portion of the Jewish nation has returned to its homeland, but the heart, soul, and mind of much of the Jewish nation are still in exile mode. This state of affairs must and will inevitably change. This is Torah Nation TV from Jerusalem, and we are interviewing the head of Machon Shilo, Rabbi David Bar-Hayim. Shalom, Rav Bar-Hayim.
Shalom.
Rav Avram Yitzchak Rav Kook, Zatzal, was one of the Torah giants of the 20th century. He is known for having been a profound thinker and a prolific writer. Do we have access to all of his writings?
Unfortunately, we do not. According to a letter written by former Chief Rabbi and Rosh Yeshiva of Mekaz Harav, Harav Avraham Shapira Zatzal, sent to Rav Moshe Tzuriel. According to that letter, there are approximately 100,000, and that's not a mistake, 100,000 pages of unpublished manuscript by Rav Kook. This figure appears in writing, and I personally was told by Rav Tzuriel that because he found it difficult to believe that number, he spoke to Rav Shapira about it a second time and asked him, is that in fact the number? And he said yes. That is an amazing, almost incredible amount of manuscript. And of course the first question is, why is it being kept from us? And who, if anyone, has the right to keep such information from the Jewish people? First of all, we should address the issue of ownership. When a great Torah sage writes a book or other writings which remains unpublished, to whom does that material belong after his death? Is it the private property of his family, those who inherit him legally, halachically? Or, because we are not talking simply about property, about economic value, but we're talking about Torah. And the Torah, as we all know, is Torah Tziva Lanu Moshe Morasha Keilat Yaakov. It is the Morasha, the Moresha, the tradition, the inheritance of the Jewish people as a whole. Does this really belong to the entire Jewish people? My position is simple. Torah belongs to the Jewish people. The thoughts, the words, the ideas of any great Torah sage belong to the Jewish people. And if he wrote them, he also intended that they should be seen, they should be learnt, and they should be in the public domain. Unless he explicitly and unequivocally stated otherwise. In the case of Rav Kook, we know for a fact that this was not the case. We know that during his lifetime there were those, amongst them his own son, Rav Tzvi Yehuda Kook Zatzal, who tried on a number of occasions to prevent him from publishing some of his writings, which he had decided that he wished to publish. And his position always was that, no, I know some of the things I write will be controversial, I know I will be attacked for some of the things that I'm saying, and nevertheless, I want it to be published. I do not mind the negative consequences to myself, to my reputation, to my standing. That is a price I'm willing to pay, because I believe that what I'm writing, what I'm saying, is important and must be known, must be said, and must be read. It also must be said that Rav Kook was not always successful in overcoming this opposition, often from within his own household. In the case of one book that he chose to publish in the 1920s called Al Pilei Tohar, his son Rav Tzvi Yehuda Kook, as I mentioned, was opposed to the publishing of this book, so much so that he kept pestering his father until eventually his father relented and said, I don't want to discuss any further, do as you will. This was Rav Kook's way. He was not a very domineering individual, and he was not willing to argue ad nauseam, and therefore he simply threw up his hands in despair, and he said, "Do as you will." And his son, Rav Kook, actually went to the printing house and with his own hand switched off the printing presses when they were in the middle of printing the book. I myself have in my possession the unfinished printed pages from that initial run of the book from those years, which was then all or most copies of that book were then, or those pages that were never bound, were then gathered up and essentially hidden in the Merkaz Rav Yeshiva, in the original building of the Merkaz Rav Yeshiva and Rav Kook in Jerusalem. Many years later, and this is important and relevant to our discussion, many years later, in fact exactly 1 year after Rav Kook passed away in Tafshin Mem Bet 1982, that book was published in its entirety, but in 6 places the editor found it necessary to make certain changes to the text, which he himself announced at the gathering which took place in the Merkaz Rav Yeshiva at that time, when the book was first released to the public. He announced those 6 places where those pages, where those paragraphs were in the book, and he explained why he made certain changes. So even regarding a book such as that, which was eventually published, we know for a fact that editing and censorship did take place. Thankfully, some years later, by all kinds of in interesting manners and ways which we will not discuss here in detail, some of Rav Kook's writings, some very important parts of his writings were obtained by certain individuals, the original manuscripts, and they made it their business to publish those manuscripts. The first collection that came out of 3 volumes was known as Shmona Kavatzim, the 8 books, or the 8 journals of Rav Kook, and later others were added to that. And therefore it is true on the one hand that some very important writings of Rav Kook, including many of the original writings which were used and published in other forms, in other books put out particularly by his son Rav Kook, such as in Orot and in the Perush on the Sidur, Olat Ra'aya, etc. Many of those original works were republished in these more recently published works, and one can see quite plainly the changes, the deletions and the censorship that did take place. I have in my possession copies of some of the original manuscripts, several hundreds of pages of Rav Kook's original manuscript, and I've investigated and checked these facts for myself, and it's very plain to see what was censored and why it was censored. In general, the desire to censor the writings of Rav Kook and not to publish many of them stems from his own son, as I mentioned, Rav Kook. It needs to be stated categorically that Rav Kook, the original Rav Kook, the father, Rav Avraham Yitzchak HaKohen Kook, was a very far-seeing and radical thinker who was willing to put his thoughts down on paper and without a doubt wanted them to be published. This is also why he handed over those original 8 journals that I mentioned in the year Tafresh Peidalet 1924 to Rav David HaKohen, the Nazir, and he said, "I want you to publish these writings," which the Nazir did to a large extent, and those are the books known as Arot HaKodesh. But he didn't publish all of the material there. He published much of the material that was to be found there, and it's also, it should be pointed out that he censored the writings of Rav Kook in a very, very few places, very minor and very rare, in very rare instances, much less than others. There's no question that his son, Rav Kook, was more conservative and more concerned than his father with the effect and the debate that would ensue from the publication of some of his works, some of his ideas, and the reputation that it would create for his father. It's true basically to say that Rav Kook was a purist, and Rav Kook was not such a purist. He was more in the business of forging an ideology which could be conveyed to a large audience, to a mass audience. And in this it can be said that he was successful to a large degree. But it's also equally true to say that those aspects of Rav Kook's writings and thought which Rav Kook was happy to have published and disseminated represent only part of Rav Kook's thinking, whereas other areas of his thought, which his son felt would be better kept under wraps, he was very concerned that these things not be generally known, and therefore he kept large amounts of the manuscripts in hiding, under wraps. He did not allow almost anyone to have access to them, and this was the situation until the time of his death, at which time the writings were transferred later to the premises of the Merkaz Rav Yeshiva, the newer premises of the Merkaz Rav Yeshiva. They are under lock and key in a very serious sense. It's impossible to gain access to them, and one can only wonder at what treasures of Torah thought remain for the Jewish people to discover and to benefit from. This phenomenon of hiding the words of great Torah personalities, I think, is reprehensible and very, very much to be lamented. And hopefully, just as over the years, by hook and by crook, some of the writings did appear, one hopes that things will change and somehow more of these writings will appear, so that the Jewish people will be able to imbibe and be built up and to move forward based on the groundbreaking ideas and thoughts and perceptions of Rav Kook, who was truly a unique individual to whom one can really not compare anyone at all in Jewish history to his time.
Thank you, Rabbi Bar-Hayim. And a word to our viewers. If you would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with Rabbi Bar-Hayim in honor or memory of a loved one, or if you would like to obtain Berkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.